Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, South Africa's #1 business news website, and time to talk about regulation. Well, it's something that we certainly have enough of in South Africa, red tape, but this is the kind of regulation in banking, financial services that we've certainly seen an exponential increase of ever since the global financial crisis. And you think of the Basel book and how that has grown through various iterations of the Basel rules. And I just think in response to this new operating landscape, banks have really been reassessing and adjusting their business strategies and models to cope. My next guest knows all about this. Rheta du Preez is UK and European Consulting Director at Monocle, and she's in the city, the heart of global finance. Rheta, welcome to the show. What's the mood like in London at the moment?
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me. The mood in London is actually fantastic at the moment. Everything has started happening again. It's buzzing. The sun is out. The people are out and about. So it's actually a good time to be in the city, to be honest.
Making me jealous. I've got to get over there. Now, you've got extensive experience working with banks across the world, and you currently consult for Monocle's UK and Netherlands offices. How has this global experience shaped your abilities and your knowledge in your current role?
Michael, it's difficult for me to answer that question without explaining a little bit about my journey with Monocle, right? So I started with the company 15 years ago. What drew me to Monocle at that stage was the opportunity of actually being able to work internationally. If I'm honest, I probably wasn't as excited about the financial industry as I was about the travel opportunities. And through my career at Monocle, I've had the opportunity to consult in Asia, I've consulted in Europe, in the United Kingdom. And I think the experiences you gain kind of puts things into perspective, right? If you think about the financial crisis, South Africa was a little bit protected in the financial crisis. I mean, our banks have a very closed system. So yes, we felt the repercussions of the crisis, but not as severe. At the time of the crisis, 2007, 2008, I was working in a Singaporean bank, and we were implementing an enterprise risk management solution, right? So that puts things into perspective. You get to see how banks react under those circumstances and just the pressure that comes along with it. I think following that, we had the opportunity to build things like liquidity risk systems when they became sort of the hot topic in the UK, right? So the nice thing about the international experience is you kind of get to be at the forefront. Crisis implement or impact different organizations in different ways, right? And I think we can always learn from the different jurisdictions. And I think one of the things that we don't always recognize as much as a benefit is you get to also deal with different cultures and different people. I think it's probably a common known fact that South Africans are quite direct in our approach when it comes to business. We tackle a problem head on. We're not scared of saying what the problem is. And when you get to deal with these different cultures, people all have different ideas. They have different ways of explaining things. And I think now that I'm in Europe and the UK, I mean, if you're in a project with a UK bank, as an example, you don't deal just with British people. You deal with all the Europeans. And that people management aspect, that softer side of things, which is quite important in consulting, I think through the experience in the world that I've gained, you kind of get to understand how to deal with people a little bit more subtly than our normal direct South African approach.
And I would always imagine that that direct approach actually serves you well in business, but sometimes it is the softer, subtle approaches that can get a deal or a transaction over the line or get a point across. When it comes to the question of risk, and I think there's no question that many banks need to address and further develop their risk data aggregation and risk reporting, the RDARR capabilities. And obviously the global financial crisis just demonstrated that I think banks really lack the ability to really efficiently and effectively provide their management with a true picture of the risks. And that's something that you must be working quite closely with. And it's commonly believed that South Africa lags behind Europe when it comes to the adoption and implementation of new regulations. Could you just talk about how South Africa is potentially ahead of the curve when it comes to RDR and why this is so important?
So I think if we're talking about risk data aggregation and specifically the BCBS 239 regulation that governs this, it is also important to take a look at how those regulations are structured, right? So the regulation is first and foremost focused on GSIBs, globally systemically important banks. Now, it's no surprise that South Africa doesn't have any of those. I think there's only about 30 on the FSB's list at the moment.
Yeah.
But then the next layer down, the next layer of banks which face a lot of pressure to get this implemented is your DSIBs, your domestically systemically important banks, right? Now, the South African banking industry is a little bit more concentrated if you compare it to what you see in Europe, as an example. And in South Africa, I think we've got 17 banks headquartered in South Africa. In the UK, we've got in excess of 300 banks, 160 odd of those are headquartered in the UK, right? So that's massively different. So almost every bank in South Africa is seen as domestically systemically important. And those banks face a little bit more pressure in complying with this regulation a little bit sooner than the rest of the banks, which fall in that and other bucket. So in South Africa, there has been a bit of a drive. The regulators have said, guys, you need to implement BCBS 239, which is a good thing, right? And it's the bigger banks, your top 4 banks in South Africa started doing this, but also the financial market in South Africa is quite small. So people talk to each other. They start realizing that this isn't merely a tick in the box exercise, right? Something like BCBS 239 actually can help you understand the risk a lot better. It gives you a lot more trust in your data and what you're actually reporting to the regulator. So that positive news starts sort of spreading through the market, and then everybody jumps onto that bandwagon. So in Europe and the UK, your DC banks, especially the bigger banks, your GSIBs, those guys have made quite a lot of progress on their journey into becoming BCBS 239 compliant, but there are so many banks who haven't even started, who haven't looked at it because they don't have the pressure from their regulators yet, or not, at least not the same level of pressure. So what we are seeing in the UK is the local regulator here is sending a lot of letters to CEOs saying, guys, we need to focus on the reliability of regulatory returns. You need to start understanding what you're reporting to us, but there's no sort of compliance issue just yet, and that will still come. Whereas in South Africa, we've had to comply. Our banks have had to push on and get through that, and that now gives us an advantage. It gives us an advantage on complying with any other regulation because we now understand the data landscape. We understand how all that data comes together to fulfill risk requirements, finance requirements, whatever it is.
And I think often when you look at this through a strategic lens, I think getting a better handle of your data is always a good thing inside an organization like a bank. So you can look at it beyond just compliance. You can derive some strategic benefit from having a better understanding of your data. Now, another hot topic where South Africa is doing well is obviously Basel IV. Can you just explain what this is and how South Africa is handling it compared with what you see over in Europe?
So the Basel IV regulation is an enhancement of the Basel regulations you spoke about in the intro that we've seen all the way back into the 1980s. So this latest change of Basel IV deals specifically with some aspects that we've seen in market risk. So enhancements to, I think they refer to it as a fundamental review of the trading book. But then also it looks at credit risk specifically, and it almost takes a step back in terms of credit risk, right? So it looks at getting banks to apply a standardized methodology, which means you can kind of see from an entire market perspective if what the risk is that the system is facing. So when you have to implement a standardized approach as opposed to the advanced approach that many banks have been used to implementing, you need a lot more data. We just spoke about BCBS, right? You need to understand where that data comes from. You need to be able to use it for multiple purposes. And I think the South African banks have traditionally been very good and very focused on their risk management. This now, in conjunction with something like a BCBS, which means they've just gone through a redesign of their data landscape and understanding their data landscape, puts them in a really, really good position to fulfill those new regulations that the regulators have come up with. Basel IV is one of those tricky ones because I think if you look at locally in South Africa as well as here in Europe, it's been being pushed out quite a bit. The European deadline has recently been moved to 2025. South Africa currently is still on 2023, and I think you'll see a lot of progress being made in the big banks in South Africa towards being Basel IV compliant. Pretty sure that deadline will move as well, but I think they'll probably be ready a lot sooner. And in Europe, what you'll see and what we see at the moment is, again, the bigger banks, the guys who have a lot of pressure from the regulators, they'll be ready. They'll do their parallel runs in times. But there's a lot of these smaller banks who haven't even started on this journey, who haven't started collecting the information, the data. They rely on the fact that we keep pushing out this deadline. And then the problem that you face is at the end of the day, they have to sort of hustle to just get something together. And those tend to be sticky tape solutions, where in South Africa, you get a lot more strategic solutions to regulations like this.
Yeah, and to my earlier point, who drives that inside the organization then? Because often we see, I think, the role of the CIO is kind of morphing and embracing all of these different challenges to understand the data at your disposal, to then cross-cut to the CFO and the CEO. How do you see this being driven internally inside these organizations?
So from a risk management perspective, obviously there's a requirement to comply with regulation, right? And that sits firmly within the CRO and CFO space. The CFO is ultimately, in most cases, responsible for ensuring we understand how much capital we need to hold and that sort of thing. But you do see, and you also see a different flavor on projects, always across the globe. If it's a regulatory project, it's a must-have. So that drive starts even before you enter the bank. It starts from a regulatory perspective, but on the ground in the bank, your CFO and your CRO know that they need to comply with these regulations, and then obviously the CIO and your technology officers as well. They have to come on the journey. Those are probably not the guys that says, yes, guys, let's go and let's comply with Basel IV. That'll be your CRO, but the CIO and the CTO have to be enablers to achieve this.
Now, Europe obviously does lead South Africa in other areas, and I think here specifically around the taxonomy that's developing in Europe around climate, things like climate risk and sustainable finance. It seems to be a taxonomy that is very well developed. We're still grappling with it here in South Africa. How can we improve in these areas?
So climate risk is the hot topic, right? I mean, we've just had COP26. There's a lot of energy around climate risk. I've just actually recently had the privilege of joining a risk forum where climate risk was the hot topic. And I think if you look at how it's being embraced in Europe, again, it starts with who's the driver behind that change. Governments have made some serious promises. And how are they going to achieve on those promises? They've pulled the trigger and they said the banking industry have to help us to achieve those promises that we've made. So there is a bit of pressure on the banks to start addressing this issue. But what I find is so positive is, in these conversations, obviously it had to start from somewhere. It started with pressure from the regulators saying, the government's actually saying, banks, you need to help us. We need to start looking at your balance sheet. What are you funding? Do you know the suppliers of your customers, as an example? But now that has turned into some positive energy, and the guys are actually saying, we can make a change, right? If we do it the right way. Now, this is where it gets really complicated, because how are we going to get regulations to catch up with making sure we get the right practical outcome of climate risk and sustainable finance reporting? Because if we just put capital charges on, it's going to incentivize the wrong behavior. And I think it is exciting to be here, because now we can see how it evolves. We can see a lot of people are starting to collect data. They're starting to understand what their balance sheets look like. What we're seeing in South Africa, strangely, is something similar, because in South Africa, the banks themselves are starting to take a look at that. We have a lot of projects ongoing where we're starting to collect data to start to understand what that balance sheet looks like. I think the difference is we probably don't have the same pressures from our government and our regulators as we are seeing already in Europe. I mean, Europe are already starting to talk about capital charges. They're already starting to talk about the disclosures that we need to put out. And that's probably an area where I think the South African market will learn from the European market, as opposed to the other way around, where basically, yes, you can probably take some experience from the South African market and use that in the international market.
I mean, it's something that's going to touch South African business eventually. If you just look at the CBAMs, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and the way trade is now going to be directed through this climate lens, it's going to be increasingly difficult to tap one of our key export markets unless, as a business, you're thinking about climate finance and risk through those lenses. Now, another upcoming focus area in South Africa is deposit insurance, and it's already quite advanced over in Europe. So I think another area where we could probably learn from Europe's first mover advantage here. Why is this so important to get right here in South Africa?
It is, oh man, it is so important. It affects all of our retail customers, right? We tend to focus a lot on the low volume, high value corporates when we look at banking, but we shouldn't forget about you and me and the everyday guy. I think, again, through the financial crisis, we've seen a lot more bank failures in an international market where they have a lot more banks that could fail. And through that, the impact on the everyday guy on the streets is seen and felt a lot more. So those guys had to start thinking about, how do I make sure my retail deposits are insured? How do I make sure that if something does go seriously wrong, I have a mechanism in place to unwind that exposure and to actually give the guy on the street back his money? South Africa, I think, have made tremendous progress in the last while on this particular front. Cody is being implemented in banks across the country, but in this particular area, the UK and Europe is way more advanced, and this insurance has been in place for some time now. So it is, for us, it gives us the experience to see how these challenges were addressed from a data perspective, from a systems perspective, to make sure we can report on the necessary metrics to our regulators, so that the regulator can understand what am I actually insuring at the end of the day. Because ultimately they have to know this, right? Otherwise, we just introduce a new risk into the financial system.
Yeah, that is always the concern of unintended consequences through having this ratcheting up of regulation. And I mean, banks are the most highly regulated entities in the world. Anyone who complains about fair weather banking and all of that, well, you need to understand just why banks have to roll everything they do over 1 million times before they make a decision. Now, speaking of across industries, Monocle has a presence across multiple jurisdictions, UK, Netherlands, alongside the South African business. How do you feel this equips you to bring a unique perspective to projects in all of these regions?
Different jurisdictions are at different levels of maturity when it comes to implementing regulations, when it comes to adopting new regulations. As Monocle, we have this benefit of taking our experience from abroad, taking our experience locally, and sort of cross-pollinating. I think that sort of cross-pollination of information and skills and just understanding the project implementation environment, that helps Monocle significantly in helping our customers meet their needs. In addition to that, there's always a personal aspect, right? People have careers and they want to build their careers. They want to gain international experience. And that has been one of the things that for me in my personal journey has been so exciting. And Monocle also offers that to guys, right? Monocle offers that platform from which you can get international experience. You can get experience in different topics, and things that might not be a hot topic in South Africa might be a hot topic in Europe, and you're passionate about that, right? And we can give you the opportunity to go to Europe to hone your skills and to then bring your skills back to South Africa and help the local institutions implement the same challenges, which is quite exciting to see, to be honest.
It sounds like I need to set up a meeting between you and Daniel Manele, who's been tasked by the president to manage that $8.5 billion fund that was pledged at COP26. I was chatting to him the other day, and he says there's no term sheet yet. So, big promises by government. He's now got to make it work. But a really exciting time, and I think there's a lot of upside, certainly for South African businesses to be looking into these markets that potentially are further down the track on these issues. Say, how can we learn? And there's always going to be some amount of tension between managing risk and engaging in this digital transformation work that you've got to do and managing your data. But no better way to do it than by partnering with an institution like Monocle that's got that cross-pollination and experience across the board. So Rheta, it's been a great pleasure chatting to you, and look forward to having you on the platform sometime soon. Take care.
Thank you so much, Michael. Have a great afternoon.